Welcome back, everybody, to the Fresh Catholic Bible Study Series, Gospel of Mark edition. This is episode number 12, and today we're going to be working our way through chapter 9 of Mark's Gospel. And recall, Mark's Gospel is the shortest of the four. It only has 16 chapters, so we're past the halfway mark. We're doing chapter 9 of 16, and at this point, we're getting very, very close to Holy Week. Because Holy Week in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus enters Jerusalem and makes his triumphal entry at the beginning of Holy Week in chapter 11 of Mark. We're in chapter 9 today, so in the background, the cross, the passion, death, resurrection is looming closer and closer and closer. So we want to kind of keep that as a backdrop. So, chapter 9, now normally what I like to do is, and what I've done so far in the previous 8 chapters, is I go, event by event by event. I give you the title of the event, the verses that it covers, and then we unpack the event. For chapter 9, I want to switch it up just slightly, and we're still going to go event by event, but I'm going to kind of group these events into 3 groups. Now, the first group is going to cover the first 28 verses of this chapter, and it's going to cover the transfiguration at the top of the mountain, and then the demon-possessed boy at the base of the mountain. So basically, and I want to group these two kind of together and talk about them in kind of parallel fashion, because they're really kind of two sides of the same coin. They're two ends to the same story. While Jesus and the 3 disciples and Moses and Elijah are on top of the mountain, you've got a crowd with the rest of the disciples, with the scribes and Pharisees and a demon-possessed boy at the bottom of the mountain. So actually, these two things real time are going on at the same time. So I kind of want to just relate that in that fashion. So we'll take the first 2 events of this chapter, the transfiguration and the demon-possessed boy, and we'll kind of lump them together, and I'll talk about them in kind of parallel fashion. Then the next thing we'll talk about is Jesus gives the second of his 3 passion predictions. Recall last week in chapter 8, he gave the first passion prediction to his disciples. Chapter 9, he'll give the second one, and in chapter 10, he'll give the third one, because as I mentioned, chapter 11 starts Holy Week. So we're in the second of 3 passion predictions that Jesus gives his disciples. And one of the things we'll notice when we compare this second one with the first one is each passion prediction, Jesus drops in a few more clarifying details. So the picture becomes clearer and clearer with each of the 3 passion predictions. So that'll be the second main thing we do. And then basically the second half of this chapter is a bunch of teachable moments Jesus engages in, a bunch of different teachings Jesus talks to his disciples about. So again, group 1, the transfiguration and the demon-possessed boy. Group 2, even though it's not really a group, is the passion prediction. And group 3 are the teachings Jesus gives to round out this chapter. So that's how we'll kind of track through the chapter. We'll still do it in the order that the events come out, but we'll kind of group them together this time. So kind of with that as a background and as kind of our roadmap, let's begin. Chapter 9, verses 1 to 7 is the transfiguration, and then verses 13 to 28 is that demon-possessed boy. So, how does Mark record the transfiguration? He starts out by telling us that Jesus took, now we got 12 disciples, right? Jesus took 3 of the 12, Peter, James, and John, up a mountain with him. So let me hit the pause button for a second. He takes 3 of his disciples up the mountain. That means the other 9 are at the base of the mountain. So that's kind of the first thing you want to try and visualize. Now let's hone in a little deeper. Who are those 3? Peter, James, and John. Now those 3 kind of made up his inner circle. And we'll see them again because those are the 3 that he takes further into the Garden of Gethsemane. He and all 12 disciples enter the garden. He takes these same 3 further into the garden. So this is the first time we actually see him, but it won't be the last. And these 3, Peter, James, and John, form his inner circle. So he takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain with him, okay? Now they get up to the mountain, and let me hit the pause button again. The fact that this happens in a mountain cues us up that all the way back even to the Old Testament, okay, events that happened on mountains were very, very significant. So when Mark starts us off by telling us Jesus took 3 disciples and they went up the mountain, we cue in on that word mountain and we know, okay, this event is going to take place on a mountain. All the way back to the Old Testament, significant events happen on a mountain. So I'm going to prepare myself for some significant event to happen. So let's hit the play button again. He's going up the mountain with his 3 disciples. And at the top of the mountain, Moses and Elijah appear. Now again, let's hit the pause button. Moses, big-time Old Testament figure. God used him to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. Elijah, big-time Old Testament figure, one of the major prophets, okay? So by their right, each of them is a big-time Old Testament figure, but there were a lot of big-time Old Testament figures. Abraham, okay? King David, King Solomon, some of the other prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah. So there's a lot of big-time Old Testament figures. Why these 2 in particular? Well, we know, because Jesus is going to mention this in his public ministry, that he didn't come to abolish the law, the Mosaic law. He came to fulfill it. And that gives us a little hint as to why these 2 figures. Because Moses stands for the law, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible that he himself penned. So Moses stands for the law, Elijah stands for the prophets. And when you say law and prophets, that's shorthand for the entire Old Testament. So the reason these 2 figures, out of all the figures that could have appeared, the reason we have these 2, Moses and Elijah, is because of what they stood for. Moses the law, Elijah the prophets, the law and the prophets being the entire Old Testament, which Jesus has come, not to abolish because the entire Old Testament pointed to him, but to fulfill. So that's the significance and the reason these 2 figures, out of so many others, appeared. The other reason these 2 figures appear is both Moses and Elijah encountered God on a mountain. Back in the Old Testament, they each had their mountaintop experience, so to speak, with God. Moses encountered God on top of a mountain. Elijah encountered God on top of the mountain. Jesus is God, so now they're encountering God again on top of a mountain. So you've got Jesus, Peter, James, and John, the inner circle, heading up the mountain. They get up there, Moses and Elijah appear, okay? Now, good old Peter. Again, in a previous episode, I said, I have a special fondness for Peter because he's like every man, right? You look through the scriptures and, he's putting his foot in his mouth here. He's blurting something out there. He's over-promising something here. He's writing checks he can't cash, so to speak. So Peter's very relatable. He's like every man, right? So put yourself in the place of Peter. You're going up this mountain, right? All right. And who's there? Moses and Elijah. Now, they're long since dead at this point, right? But they appear. And if you're Peter, you're going, oh, I don't believe this. That's Elijah. And of course, Peter being Peter, he blurts something out, right? What does he blurt out? He says, it is good that we are here. Let me stop, okay? If Peter would have stopped right then, he would have been okay, because it is good that they're there. They're with Jesus. They're about to have, the so-called mountaintop experience. Moses is there. Elijah is there. Of course it's good that they're there, okay? And Peter recognizes that. So had he stopped there, he would have been okay. But Peter, being Peter, he continues. He then blurts out, let us build 3 booths, or kind of 3 tents. One for you, Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now let me hit the pause button. On the surface, that doesn't sound that bad. Let's build 3 tents, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. What's so bad about that? Well, what's so bad about that, and again, this was not Peter's intent, I'm sure. He probably didn't understand the significance of what he was saying in the moment because he's like in awe, right? But he says, let's build 3 booths, 3 tents. Jesus, Moses, Elijah. And what Peter is doing, even though he didn't intend it and probably didn't realize it at the time, is check this out, he's inadvertently putting Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah. 3 tents, one for each person. What Peter's doing is he is inadvertently putting Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah. And as great an Old Testament figures as Moses and Elijah are, they are not on the same level with Jesus. Jesus is God. They're not. So what Peter blurts out, the first half is good. The second half, he's a little too far over his skis. He says, it's good that we're here, which it is. And then he says, let's build 3 tents, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, inadvertently putting Jesus on the same level. Now, this is interesting. Look at what happens, okay? Because if you read through Mark's recording of this, as Peter is saying this, right, a voice from a cloud comes out. And that voice, of course, is God, right? And he says, this is my beloved Son. So it's almost as if God is saying, whoa, Peter, you're a little over your skis here, okay? You're writing another check you can't cash. I know that you don't mean this. I know this is not what you intend. I know that you probably don't even realize what you're saying. But when you say, let's build 3 tents, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for my son, okay? You're putting my son on the same level, and he's not. This is my son, Peter. They aren't. So once you kind of, peel away a couple of layers of this incident, you can see kind of the richness and maybe some of the irony and some of the humor coming out, right? So the other thing that we want to mention is when Peter says it's good that we are here, okay? Again, you think about it in our own lives, okay? Peter, and James and John for that matter, are having, as it were, a mountaintop experience. They're on a spiritual high right now. They're with Jesus. They're on top of a mountain. Moses and Elijah are there. They are experiencing a mountaintop experience, a spiritual high, all right? And if you've ever experienced a spiritual high, kind of a mountaintop experience, right? You want to stay on the mountaintop. You want to stay in that spiritual high. You don't want to go back down to, the normal world, so to speak, right? So when Peter says, it's good that we're here, let's build 3 tents, the 3 tents thing, in addition to putting Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah, Peter is kind of intimating, because he wants to build tents for them to stay in, right? That, hey, this is great. This is a mountaintop experience. We're all on a spiritual high. We don't want it to end. Let's just stay on the mountaintop, all right? Perfectly normal if you're in the middle of a spiritual high. You want to stay there. And Peter does the same, okay? He wants to stay there and build the tents. So a couple of different angles as far as these tents are concerned, right? But then God, sets up straight, says, hey, Peter, this is my son, Moses and Elijah, great biblical figures in their own right, but they're not my son, okay? So, kind of interesting. Now, the mountaintop experience, as they all do, the spiritual high, as they all do, has to come to an end, right? Now, As soon as God says, "This is my son, listen to him," Moses and Elijah disappear. And the only person there is Jesus, indicating that Jesus is going to be fulfilling the Old Testament. All right? Because now the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, right? They've disappeared. Jesus is there. Okay? So they pointed to Jesus, and now Jesus is the only one on top of the mountain again. Interesting significance there. So the mountaintop experience ends. Jesus and his disciples start heading back down the mountain. And then once again, Jesus invokes the messianic secret. He says, don't tell anyone about what you've experienced here. And again, as in previous podcasts, we indicating that Jesus invokes this messianic secret. He wants to keep certain things on the down low because he's still operating on his Father's divine timetable, his Father's divine plan. He's still got teaching to do. He's still got miracles to perform, okay? And he needs that time still to do that. So Peter, James, and John, keep what you experienced here on the down low. So they head down the mountain. So now here's kind of the parallel. Here's the where Mark engages in another one of his techniques. Remember at the beginning we said Mark really uses two main literary techniques. The Mark and sandwich, where he'll start an episode, stop it, interject another episode, and then finish the first one. So the Mark and sandwich, and the contrast. Here's another case of Mark using his contrast technique. Because while all of what I've just unpacked has been going on at the top of the mountain, at the bottom of the mountain, you've got a completely different scene. So again, if you're watching this, it's almost as if you're looking at your TV, and the TV goes to split screen, right? And on one side is Jesus, the three disciples, Moses, and Elijah on top of the mountain, right? And on the other half of the screen is the other 9 disciples, a crowd of people, the scribes and the Pharisees, a dad and his demon-possessed boy at the bottom of the mountain. So you've got these two scenes, these two contrasting scenes going on at the same time, all right? So while Jesus and the disciples were at the top of the mountain, what was going on at the bottom of the mountain? Well, there was a crowd. The other 9 disciples are there, right? A crowd had arrived, including the scribes and the Pharisees. And in that crowd is a father with his a demon-possessed son. And the father is asking the disciples to exorcise the demon out of his son. And the disciples, try as they might, can't do it. And the scribes and the Pharisees are kind of mocking them, kind of chiding them at their inability to drive this demon out of the boy. Well, the disciples are trying, they can't do it. The father's getting more and more desperate, right? Now at this point, the two scenes meet. Because at this point, Jesus has now come, Jesus and the 3 disciples have now come all the way down the mountain, and now they have come upon this scene. And Jesus says, well, you know, what's going on? What's the deal here? And the father says, well, yeah, I've got this demon-possessed son, and I brought him to the disciples to exorcise the demon. They can't do it. So in desperation, the father turns to Jesus, right? Well, Jesus exorcises the demon. Problem solved, right? The father and the boy go away happy, right? The scribes and the Pharisees kind of have it thrown in their face a little bit. And then the disciples, the 9 that couldn't exorcise the demon, they turn to Jesus and they're kind of dumbfounded. They're perplexed, and they want to know, hey, how come we didn't do it? We're trying and trying and trying. We can't do it. You come down the mountain, and like that, the demon is driven out. How come we couldn't do it? A legitimate and fair question, right? Jesus answers. He says, some can only be driven out with prayer and fasting. Now let's hit the pause button. The disciples, you're one of the 9 now, right? You've been trying to drive out this demon. You can't do it. The scribes and Pharisees are mocking you. The Father's getting desperate. Jesus arrives at the scene at that moment, drives out the demon. You're perplexed, you're dumbfounded, you're confused. How come we couldn't do it? You ask Jesus. Jesus responds, well, some of them can only be driven out by prayer and fasting. So if you're one of the 9 disciples, you're thinking, okay, what does that mean? How does that answer our question? How does that solve the dilemma that we couldn't do it? Well, what's behind Jesus' answer is a reminder to his disciples and to us that any good works that we do, okay, God is working through us. We never want to arrive at the point where we think we're doing it alone, without God's assistance, without God's grace. And worse yet, that we can do it, that we don't need God's assistance and God's grace. So what the scholars and the theologians have kind of theorized over the centuries here is what Jesus really meant, what was behind him saying some can only be driven out by prayer and fasting, okay, is kind of a warning to not get too filled up with yourself, not get too arrogant. Even if you're having successes, don't think it's due solely to you, okay? Keep in mind, all right, it's through God's grace, it's through God's power working through you. Because let's remind ourselves that something that Jesus says that John records in his gospel in the famous vine and branches discourse, where he's telling his disciples, and by extension the crowds, and by extension us, that, abide in me as I abide in you. And then he utters the words, without me you can do nothing. So that's kind of what's behind the scenes here, okay? The thinking has been the disciples, didn't pray, they didn't ask for God's assistance, they didn't ask for God's grace. They just figured, okay, God, you can sit this one out. We've just gone on a test run a couple of chapters before this, remember that? And they had great success, remember that? So the thinking has been that in this scene, the disciples, kind of thinking back on all the success they had in their test run, got a little carried away with themselves, got a little filled up with themselves, figured, okay, God, God, we got this one. You can sit this one out. We can drive this out through our own power. And they found out they were sadly mistaken. So the thinking has always been, his answer kind of belies the fact that, look, anything you do, all right, any good you do, all right, any good work you perform, it's God working through you, okay? Because we're sinners with a fallen human nature, right? So it's God's grace, it's God's power, it's God's wisdom working through you, and never to forget that. Never think, you're the beginning and the end, okay? You're not the Alpha and the Omega, God is. So that was the thinking of what behind Jesus' response there. So that's group number 1 of the events of this chapter. The transfiguration on top of the mountain and the disciples' inability to drive out the demon at the bottom of the mountain, okay? And the 2 things behind Peter talking about those 3 tents, putting Jesus on an equal level with Moses and Elijah, and never wanting to leave the mountaintop experience, never wanting to leave the spiritual high, which, of course, we all have to do, okay? Because life is lived at the bottom of the mountain, not so much at the top, as we all know. Now, after this, Mark records Jesus giving the second of 3 passion predictions, where he tells his disciples, look, yes, I'm the Messiah. Yes, I'm the Savior. Yes, I'm the Christ, the Son of God, okay? But here's what's going to happen and this is chapter 9 now, and it begins to happen in chapter 11. This is what's going to happen very, very shortly, okay? Yes, I'm the Messiah, but as Isaiah prophesied, I'm the suffering Messiah. So he gives the second passion prediction. And what I want us to do is kind of compare it with his first one. Now, the second one, he says, okay, guys, the Son of Man, Jesus referring to himself, is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. These men will kill him, but he'll rise again on the third day. So betrayed into the hands of men, the men will kill him, but he'll rise. Now, how does this differ in detail from his first passion prediction? Well, in his first passion prediction, he also indicates three things. He says, I'm going to be rejected by the elders and chief priests. I'm going to be put to death, and I'll rise. Okay? So let's put the two together now as Jesus, passion prediction by passion prediction, is filling in the complete picture. After the first passion prediction, if you're one of the disciples, this is what you heard. Okay? Jesus is going to be rejected by the Jewish religious leaders. He's going to be put to death, and he's going to rise. Now, look at what Jesus says. Okay? He still says, I'm going to be put to death. But he adds the additional detail, I'm going to be betrayed. He didn't say anything about betrayal in the first passion prediction. Now he interjects another detail, and that of his betrayal, which we know will happen with Judas. Now, we have the luxury of knowing the story. We know the details. We know that everything the prophets prophesied, everything Jesus predicted is going to come to pass. We know that, right? Because we have the luxury of knowing the story and looking back. But if you're one of the disciples and you're trying to take this in real time, imagine what you're thinking, okay? At this point, you're starting to drink out of a fire hose almost. You're thinking, okay, Jesus, okay, he's going to be rejected by the Jewish religious leaders. Well, that doesn't sound good. He's going to be put to death, okay? That sounds even worse. And then somewhere in there, he's also going to be betrayed. How? By whom? When? But notice that even though the details are a little bit different, okay, because he's adding as he goes, one detail remains the same in these first two passion predictions, and we'll see it again next chapter in the third. He ends every passion prediction with the fact he will rise from the dead on the third day, kind of indicating that however horrible these things sound, rejection, betrayal, put to death, that's not going to be the end of the story. That's not how the story ends. Okay? I'm going to rise from the dead. So interesting, even though he's fleshing out more and more details as he goes, one detail remains the same. Rise on the third day. So that's the second, and that happens about the middle of this chapter, the second passion prediction. Then the second half of this chapter, Jesus presents the disciples, and by extension us, a number of different teachings, right? Because they leave the mountain, right? And they're back on the road again, right? And Jesus is out front, the disciples are behind, right? And the disciples are arguing amongst themselves. Now, Jesus is God, right? He knows what they're arguing about. You know, even if he didn't overhear them, he still knows, right? So Jesus knows, or maybe even overhears what they're arguing about, right? And Jesus, you can almost imagine Jesus saying, okay, this is a good time for one of those classic teachable moments. Because what were the disciples arguing amongst themselves? Who would be the greatest when Jesus comes into his kingdom? Okay? Now you're saying, wait a second. Okay, well, let me get this straight. Jesus has just given them the second of three passion predictions. where he said, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be killed, but I'll rise again, right? Now, after hearing that, what are the disciples talking to each other about? Who's going to be the greatest when Jesus establishes his kingdom? Indicating that still, at this late stage in the game, chapter 9 in Mark, Holy Week starts chapter 11, the disciples are still not understanding the entire picture and the ramifications of it, all right? So they're arguing about themselves about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus says this is a great time for one of those classic teachable moments. And for the rest of this chapter, he gives a couple of teachings. Let's go through them one at a time, okay? Now, the first teaching we can kind of categorize under an admonition or a warning of ambition and envy, right? Because they're talking about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus indicates, look, you want to know who's going to be the greatest? It's going to be the least, okay? In my kingdom, okay, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. In my kingdom, to be greatest is to be least, all right? So when I come into my kingdom, it's not going to be like the ordinary, normal, everyday, Gentile or pagan kingdoms, right? My kingdom is going to be different. The last are going to be first. The least are going to be the greatest, all right? So, you guys arguing amongst each other, jockeying between each other, who's going to be the greatest? Really, you should be talking about, going against ambition and envy, and the last shall be first, and the least shall be the greatest. So that's the first admonition, okay? And then he underscores it. Because right after saying, basically the last will be first and the least will be the greatest, Jesus then says something that many people find curious and kind of, how does this all fit in? Jesus then says, whoever receives a child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives my Father. So you might be thinking, well, wait a second, where did that come from? Here the disciples are arguing who's going to be the greatest. Jesus warns them about that kind of earthly type of ambition. And then all of a sudden, he seemingly shifts gears and talks about receiving children. And a lot of people say, that seems out of place. It doesn't. How does that connect up? Well, it's not out of place at all. It connects up perfectly. When we understand culturally the role of children at this time, okay? Now, back then, children were not put on a pedestal, right? They had absolutely no power. They were given no honor. They were put to work early. And like women, they were considered property. So children were thought of very, very little. They were given very little position, very little status. They had no power. So when Jesus says, you want to be the greatest in my kingdom? Be the least among you. How least? Like that of a child who had no status, no power, no authority. That's how least you have to be greatest in my kingdom. So when you look at that seemingly out of place comment about children that Jesus kind of underscores his first teaching here, and you think, well, that doesn't make sense. It seems out of place. When you consider it in the context we just have, it makes perfect sense. It's perfectly in place. Because if you're one of the disciples and you're being told you want to be greatest, be the least, the thought might occur to you, well, how least? Jesus answers that by saying, you want to know how least? Like that of a child, who at that time had no status, no position, no power, no authority. That's how least you have to be greatest. So that's the first teachable moment. And then Jesus goes on. The second teaching he gives is to avoid scandal and sin. okay? Because he says, okay, listen, if you cause scandal, okay, if you cause other people to sin, okay, it would be better if a millstone would be tied around your neck and you would be thrown into the sea, all right? A pretty stark warning about causing others to sin, creating scandal, having a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the sea. Now, there's two details about this I want to bring out: the sea part and the millstone part. Now, the sea part, a lot of Jewish lore looked at the sea with a fair amount of trepidation. They looked at it as like a watery type grave. So being thrown into the sea was like being thrown into a watery grave. And then Jesus says, not only are you going to be thrown into the sea, but it'd be better for you if a great millstone was tied around your neck. Now again, back in those days, there were two millstones. There was a small millstone that a woman would use to grind wheat for bread, okay? And then there would be a large millstone, almost like a manhole cover, that donkeys and horses would pull behind them as they plowed the fields. Now, which millstone is Jesus referring here? The small, tiny one that women use to grind wheat in bowls, or that manhole-sized millstone that horses and donkeys pulled? Okay, it was that manhole-sized millstone. So if you're, and again, you're a disciple, you know the difference between these millstones, and you know the trepidation of the sea as being like a watery grave. So when Jesus says, hey, don't cause other people to sin, don't lead other people into sin, don't be a cause of scandal, because if you are, it would be better for you to have a giant manhole cover millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the watery grave that's a sea. That would have been a very stark and realistic picture for these disciples. So Jesus is not whitewashing things here, all right? He's not sugarcoating them, okay? He's saying, look, to be greatest, you have to be least. How least? That of a child. No power, no status, no authority. And as far as causing other people to sin, don't do it, because it would be better if you had a giant millstone around your neck and thrown into the sea than in causing other people and leading other people to sin. So, yeah, this is a teachable moment, and boy, is he doing some very stark teaching. And then he says, he wraps up this series of teaching with an admonition to avoid sin themselves, right? And he's talking about getting thrown into fiery Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is when Jesus talked about hell, which he did frequently, very frequently. When he talked about hell, he would always use the term Gehenna. Now, why would he do that? Well, because Gehenna was very real to his disciples. Gehenna was an actual place. Now, let's back up a little bit, okay? You've got Jerusalem. And then kind of at the bottom of Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem, is this area, okay? And this area is called the Valley of Hinnom. Gehenna, Hinnom. It's called the Valley of Hinnom. Now, way back prior to this same area was a major place for pagan worship. And the pagan worship that would be conducted in this place would be to the pagan god Molech. And to worship Molech would involve child sacrifice. So in this area, south of Jerusalem, outside the city limits, south of Jerusalem, back in the day, it was the place where pagans conducted child sacrifices to the pagan god Molech. So it was totally unsacred ground, totally, horrible ground, right? Well, now let's fast forward to this day and time in this gospel, right? That same patch of land, that same area exists, right, outside of Jerusalem. But because of what went on there previously, child sacrifice, it was totally unsacred. So what the Jewish people did is they converted that area to basically a landfill. So all the trash and all the waste that the people would have in Jerusalem would be taken outside the city limits and put into this area, the Valley of Hinnom, all right? It would be a landfill, and the trash and the waste material would be burned. So you'd constantly have fires smoldering. You'd have flames emitting thick black smoke because continuously the trash from the city and the waste material from the city would be being burned. This was the city landfill. And because you had trash and waste material, it would attract worms. That's why Jesus says, when he's talking about fiery Gehenna, where the fire is never quenched and the worm never dies, that actually was a depiction of what happened in that particular area. The fire never died because they were constantly burning the trash, and you'd always have smoldering fires, and worms would always be around. So when Jesus wanted to impress upon his disciples, and by extension us, look, you want to avoid hell, okay? You want to avoid sin. And in order to, again, try and get his point across of just how horrible hell is, like Jesus did all during his public ministry in his teachings, he used situations and places that were real situations and real places that his disciples and those crowds knew about, that they could see with their eyes. So back then in the first century, if you wanted to conjure up a depiction of what hell looked like in your mind's eye, all you would have to do is look at that area south of Jerusalem, outside the city limits, the Valley of Hinnom. And that is kind of the picture Jesus wanted them to conjure up in terms of hell. And the Valley of Hinnom became known as Gehenna. So let's see if we can collect ourselves. Quite a chapter here, huh? We start out with two kind of parallel scenes, right? The top of the mountain versus the bottom of the mountain. We've unpacked Peter's talking about booths and the significance of those. Then at the bottom of the mountain, we've unpacked Jesus' response that some can only be exercised out by prayer and fasting. Then we looked at the additional detail Jesus drops in his second passion prediction, the detail of the betrayal. But we also made mention of one detail doesn't change, and that is he'll rise again on the third day. And then he gives a series of very, very graphic and stark teachings about avoiding ambition, avoiding leading others into sin, and avoiding sin yourself. Mark's gospel may be the shortest, and it is, and it may be action-packed, which it is, but hopefully you're getting the idea that it's small, but it's mighty, and it packs a punch. Now again, this is chapter 9. In chapter 11, Jesus is going to make his triumphal entry into Jerusalem to start the last week of his earthly life. So we're only having finished chapter 9 now, we're only one chapter away from Holy Week. And that gives us a little bit of an indicator that what happens in this next chapter, chapter 10, what Jesus says and what Jesus does, he's doing it essentially on the eve of Holy Week, which suggests to us that it has super significance. Everything Jesus taught and did obviously has super significance, right? But these things that we'll look at next chapter, we want to keep in mind they're happening on the eve, so to speak, of Holy Week. So that gives them just a little bit extra significance. Now, what are these things that Jesus says? What are these things that Jesus does on the eve of Holy Week? Well, I guess you're going to just have to tune in next time for episode 13 and chapter number 10. How's that for a teaser? So with that, again, thank you for watching the Gospel of Mark, the Fresh Catholic Bible Study series. Until next time, I'm Charles Merritt. Have a blessed week and take care, everybody.